Texas, 1944. When the military trucks crossed the gates of the old ranch converted into a prisoner camp, many believed they were entering another kind of hell. Among them was Hans Reuter, 32, former clarinetist from Berlin. Little did he know that in that piece of hot, dusty land, he would learn something the war had erased, the universal language of music that connects all hearts. Before we continue, subscribe and hit the bell. Here we retell the human stories forgotten by war. The sun was merciless that first morning as Hans stepped down from the transport truck, his worn boots hitting the Texas dirt with a dull thud. In his weathered hands, he clutched a battered case, the only possession the guards had allowed him to keep. Inside lay his clarinet, silent for months, its silver keys tarnished by neglect and the dampness of transport ships. The camp stretched before them like a small town of canvas and wood. Rows of barracks stood under the blazing sky, surrounded by simple wire fencing that seemed almost casual compared to the fortress-like compounds Hans had imagined. Cowboys on horseback patrolled the perimeter, their wide-brimmed hats casting long shadows across the ground. The sight was so foreign, so unexpected, that several prisoners stopped walking just to stare. "Willkommen in Texas," muttered Friedrich, a baker from Munich who had been captured alongside Hans during the retreat from Normandy. His voice carried a mixture of resignation and bewilderment as he watched a cowboy dismount near the gate, spurs jingling with each step. Hans said nothing. He had spoken little since his capture, the music in his soul seemingly frozen by the brutality he had witnessed. The clarinet case felt heavier with each passing day, not from its physical weight, but from the silence it contained. Music had once been his life. Evening concerts in Berlin's elegant halls, morning practice sessions that filled his small apartment with melodies that made neighbors pause on the stairs to listen. Now it felt like carrying the corpse of his former self. The processing was surprisingly efficient, and more surprisingly, respectful. The American guards spoke in calm tones, and while Hans couldn't understand much English, the absence of shouting and violence was notable. One guard, a tall man with kind eyes and a thick Texas drawl, noticed Hans's case and gestured toward it with curiosity rather than suspicion. "What you got there, partner?" the guard asked, his tone genuinely interested. Hans opened the case slowly, revealing the clarinet nestled in faded velvet. The guard's face lit up with recognition, and something that looked almost like excitement. He called over another guard, a shorter man with calloused hands, who examined the instrument with obvious appreciation. "Well, I'll be damned," the second guard whistled low. "Haven't seen one of these in years. You play this thing?" Hans nodded hesitantly, unsure if admitting his musical ability would bring punishment or privilege. In his experience with military authorities, talents were either exploited or crushed. But these men seemed different. Their interest appeared genuine, free from the calculating coldness he had grown accustomed to. The guards assigned the prisoners to their barracks, and Hans found himself sharing space with 15 other German soldiers in a long, airy building that was surprisingly comfortable. Wooden bunks lined the walls, and small windows allowed cross breezes that provided relief from the Texas heat. It wasn't luxury, but it was far from the hellish conditions they had been prepared for. As evening approached, Hans sat on his bunk, the clarinet case beside him like a faithful dog. Around him, his fellow prisoners talked quietly in German, sharing stories of capture, speculating about their fate, and marveling at the unexpected civility of their treatment. The food had been simple but adequate, beef stew and bread that reminded Friedrich of home. There had been no beatings, no humiliations, just the quiet efficiency of a well-run facility. Through the barracks window, Hans could see cowboys gathering around a campfire near the main building. Their laughter carried on the evening air, mixing with the distant lowing of cattle and the rustle of wind through mesquite trees. It was a peaceful sound, almost musical in its rhythm, and for the first time in months, Hans felt something stir in his chest. Not quite hope, but something approaching it. The night brought unexpected sounds. Instead of harsh commands or the march of boots, there was music drifting from the guards' quarters. Someone was playing a guitar, and voices joined in harmony on songs Hans didn't recognize but found oddly comforting. The melodies were simple, honest, and filled with a longing that transcended language barriers. Hans lay on his bunk, listening to the distant music, his fingers unconsciously moving over the keys of his silent clarinet. For the first time since his capture, he wondered if perhaps this place might offer something he thought he had lost forever. As sleep finally came, he dreamed not of war or capture, but of music floating across a starlit Texas sky. The second morning brought with it a surprise that would change everything. Hans had been assigned to work detail in the camp's maintenance shed, a job that seemed routine until Sergeant Jake Morrison, the tall guard from the day before, appeared in the doorway with a knowing smile. "Reuter, right?" Morrison asked, consulting a clipboard. His pronunciation of the German name was careful, respectful. "The one with the clarinet?" Hans nodded, uncertain where this conversation was heading. In his experience, being singled out rarely led to anything good. But Morrison's demeanor remained friendly, almost conspiratorial. "Well, here's the thing," Morrison continued, leaning against the doorframe. "We got ourselves a situation. See, there's going to be a barn dance this Saturday, biggest social event of the year for folks around here. Problem is, our usual band leader, old Pete Martinez, threw out his back something fierce. Doc says he'll be laid up for weeks." Hans listened intently, understanding perhaps half the words, but sensing the importance of what was being said. Morrison gestured toward the camp's main area, where several cowboys were gathered around a table, apparently in heated discussion. "Now, word got around that you're some kind of musician. Professional, they say." Morrison's eyes sparkled with possibility. "What do you think about helping us out?" "Nothing fancy, just some music to get folks dancing. We got other fellas who can play, guitar, fiddle, even a harmonica. But we need someone who understands music, you know, someone who can lead." The request was so unexpected, so contrary to everything Hans had prepared himself for, that he stood speechless for several moments. A barn dance. They wanted him to play music, not as forced labor or cruel entertainment, but as a genuine contribution to their community celebration. I don't understand much English," Hans finally managed in his broken English, the words feeling strange after months of silence. Morrison waved dismissively. "Music don't need much talking, partner. Universal language and all that. Besides, we got plenty of folks who can translate if needed." He paused, studying Hans's face. "What do you say? Willing to help us out?" The afternoon brought an informal audition of sorts. Morrison had gathered several camp personnel in the recreation area, cowboys, guards, and even the camp commander, Colonel William Hayes, a silver-haired man with laugh lines around his eyes. They had assembled a makeshift band, Tommy Rodriguez on guitar, Buck Williams with his fiddle, and Charlie Harmonica Jones with his collection of mouth harps. Hans opened his clarinet case with trembling hands, acutely aware of all the eyes upon him. The instrument felt foreign after so long, its weight both familiar and strange. He assembled it slowly, checking the reed, running his fingers over the keys to ensure they moved freely. "What can you play?" Colonel Hayes asked kindly. "Something we might know." Hans thought for a moment, then began with something simple, a German folk melody that his grandmother had sung to him as a child. The notes flowed hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence as muscle memory returned. The melody was sweet and melancholy, speaking of distant homes and cherished memories. The cowboys listened in respectful silence, and when Hans finished, Buck Williams stepped forward with his fiddle. "That was real pretty," he said. "Mind if I try to follow along this time?" What happened next felt like magic. As Hans began the melody again, Buck's fiddle found the harmony, weaving around the clarinet line with intuitive understanding. Tommy's guitar joined in with gentle chords, and Harmonica Jones added subtle bass notes that gave the song unexpected depth. When they finished, Colonel Hayes was smiling broadly. "Well, that's the prettiest music I've heard in months." He turned to Morrison. "Sergeant, I think we found our band leader." The rest of the afternoon was spent learning each other's musical languages. Hans played familiar German tunes, while the Americans shared their country songs, folk ballads and dance numbers. Language barriers dissolved as they communicated through rhythm and melody, each musician contributing their unique voice to create something entirely new. As the sun began to set, painting the Texas sky in shades of orange and pink, Hans realized something profound had happened. For the first time since his capture, he felt useful, valued, even welcomed. These men weren't seeing him as an enemy or a prisoner. They were seeing him as a musician, a fellow human being with something beautiful to offer. Now, tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time of day this story found you. It's curious to know how far these human memories reach. The week that followed was unlike anything Hans had experienced since his capture. Instead of the grinding routine of prison labor, his days were filled with music, planning, and an unexpected sense of purpose. The barn dance had become the camp's primary focus, with everyone from the colonel to the kitchen staff contributing ideas and assistance. Every morning after breakfast, Hans and his newfound musical partners gathered in the recreation hall for rehearsals. The space had been transformed into a makeshift music room, with chairs arranged in a circle and music stands borrowed from the nearby town school. The acoustics were surprisingly good, with the wooden walls providing warmth to their sound. Tommy Rodriguez proved to be more than just a competent guitarist. He was a natural arranger with an ear for harmony that impressed even Hans. During their third practice session, Tommy suggested they adapt one of Hans's German waltzes for American dancers. "See, the thing about Texas folks," Tommy explained, using a mixture of English and gestures that Hans was learning to interpret. "They love to dance, but they need music that moves them. Your waltz is beautiful, but can we make it swing a little more?" Hans listened as Tommy demonstrated, transforming the elegant 3/4 time into something with more rhythmic drive. Buck Williams joined in, his fiddle adding bluegrass flourishes that shouldn't have worked with a German waltz, but somehow did. The result was a fusion that belonged neither to Bavaria nor Texas, but to something entirely new, a musical bridge between two worlds. Word of the upcoming performance had spread beyond the camp. Local ranchers and their families were planning to attend, turning what had started as a simple barn dance into a community celebration. Hans learned this from Maria Santos, the camp's translator and liaison with the local community. Maria, a Mexican-American woman in her 40s, had been tasked with helping the musicians communicate and plan. "The whole county's talking about it," Maria told Hans during one of their translation sessions. "Haven't had a proper dance in months, what with so many of the young men off fighting. Folks are excited to hear real music again." The responsibility felt enormous. Hans had performed for audiences before, Berlin concert halls, military ceremonies, even street festivals during happier times. But this felt different. These people weren't just expecting entertainment, they were looking for joy, for a temporary escape from the weight of wartime worry, and they were trusting a German prisoner of war to provide it. Colonel Hayes had authorized the creation of what he called the Camp Liberty Orchestra, a name that made Hans smile despite himself. The irony wasn't lost on him that he had found more musical freedom as a prisoner in Texas than he had experienced as a soldier in the German army. Here, no one dictated what he could or couldn't play. No one questioned his choice of arrangements or expression. The barn where the dance would be held was located on a neighboring ranch owned by a weathered cowboy named Sam Tucker. Tucker, a man in his 60s with hands like leather and a heart apparently made of gold, had volunteered his space and his time to make the event special. Hans had met him during a site visit to check acoustics and staging. "Music's been mighty scarce around these parts," Tucker had told him through Maria's translation. Lost my boy Jimmy in Italy last year. He used to play piano at all our gatherings. Having music back, well, it means something special. The conversation had touched Hans deeply. Here was a man who had lost his son to the same war that had made Hans a prisoner, yet he was opening his home and his heart to provide joy for his community. It was a level of grace and forgiveness that challenged everything Hans thought he understood about enemies and allies. Preparation involved more than just music. The camp's seamstress, Mrs. Dorothy Klein, had volunteered to create stage outfits for the band. She had approached Hans with fabric samples and measuring tape, chattering excitedly about making them look proper and professional. "Can't have you boys looking like ragamuffins," she had declared, pinning fabric around Hans's shoulders. "This is going to be the social event of the season. People will be talking about this dance for years to come." The costume fittings had been surprisingly emotional for Hans. Mrs. Klein treated him with the same care and attention she would give any performer, asking his opinion on colors and styles, making adjustments to ensure his comfort while playing. It was such a normal, human interaction that it almost brought him to tears. As Saturday approached, Hans found himself experiencing something he hadn't felt in years: genuine excitement. Not the adrenaline of battle or the relief of survival, but the pure anticipation of sharing music with people who wanted to hear it. His fellow prisoners had noticed the change in him, commenting that he seemed to stand taller, speak more, even smile occasionally. Friedrich, his bunkmate, had been particularly observant. "You look like yourself again," he had said one evening, as Hans practiced scales on his clarinet. "I hadn't realized how much of you had gone missing until I saw it coming back." The night before the dance, Hans lay in his bunk, listening to the familiar sounds of the camp settling down for sleep. But instead of the anxiety that usually accompanied important performances, he felt a profound sense of gratitude. Tomorrow, he would stand before a crowd of Americans and play music that would make them happy. In a world torn apart by war, he had been given the gift of bringing people together through melody and rhythm. As he drifted off to sleep, Hans's fingers moved silently over imaginary clarinet keys, rehearsing one final time the songs that would transform him from prisoner to performer, from enemy to friend. Saturday evening arrived with a spectacular Texas sunset that painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, as if nature itself was preparing for the celebration to come. Hans stood outside the camp's main gate, dressed in the crisp white shirt and black trousers that Mrs. Klein had tailored for him, his clarinet case in hand and his heart pounding with anticipation. The journey to Sam Tucker's ranch took 20 minutes by truck, with Hans and his fellow musicians accompanied by a small contingent of guards who seemed more like escorts to a formal event than prison supervisors. Sergeant Morrison had traded his military uniform for civilian clothes, while Colonel Hayes wore his dress uniform with obvious pride in what his camp had accomplished. As they approached the ranch, Hans could hardly believe what he saw. The large red barn had been transformed into a magical venue, with strings of electric lights creating a warm glow against the darkening sky. Lanterns hung from fence posts, creating a pathway that led to the barn's open doors. Cars and trucks were already parked in neat rows, and the sound of laughter and conversation drifted across the evening air. Inside the barn, the transformation was even more remarkable. The usual farm equipment had been moved aside to create a spacious dance floor. Hay bales served as seating around the perimeter, covered with colorful blankets and cushions that local families had contributed. A small stage had been constructed at one end of the barn, decorated with bunting in red, white, and blue. The crowd was larger than Hans had expected, easily 200 people of all ages, from elderly couples to young children who ran between the hay bales in their Sunday best. Ranch hands stood alongside town merchants, farm wives chatted with school teachers, and everyone seemed united in their excitement for the evening's entertainment. Sam Tucker approached Hans as the band was setting up their equipment. The old rancher's eyes were bright with emotion as he shook Hans's hand warmly. "Son," Tucker said, his voice thick with feeling, "I want you to know what this means to all of us. It's been a hard year, losing so many of our boys overseas. Tonight, you're giving us something we desperately need, a reason to celebrate life instead of mourning death." Hans felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders, but it was a good weight, the kind that comes from being trusted with something precious. Through Maria's translation, he managed to express his gratitude for the opportunity and his promise to give everything he had to make the evening special. As the sun finally disappeared behind the Texas hills, Colonel Hayes stepped onto the stage to address the crowd. The barn fell silent except for the rustle of hay and the distant lowing of cattle. "Ladies and gentlemen," the colonel began, his voice carrying easily through the barn, "tonight we're privileged to witness something special, the power of music to bring us together regardless of our differences. Our band tonight includes some fine American musicians and one very talented German prisoner of war who has reminded us all that humanity transcends the boundaries of conflict." The applause was warm and welcoming, without a trace of hostility or suspicion. Hans stepped forward with his fellow musicians, and as the crowd's approval washed over him, he felt something break free inside his chest, a joy that had been imprisoned far longer than his body had been. The first song was a gentle waltz that Hans and Tommy had arranged together, blending German melody with American harmony. As the music began, Hans watched elderly couples take to the dance floor with practiced grace, their movements speaking of decades of shared dances and shared life. Young couples followed, some clearly still learning the steps, their laughter adding percussion to the melody. By the third song, the barn was alive with movement and music. Buck Williams's fiddle sang out over the dance floor, while Harmonica Jones provided a rhythmic foundation that had people clapping along. Hans found himself improvising, adding flourishes and variations that responded to the energy of the crowd. The evening's repertoire included everything from traditional American square dances to adapted German folk songs, from cowboy ballads to polkas that had the entire barn spinning in organized chaos. Hans had worried about language barriers, but music proved to be the universal translator that bridged every gap. During a brief intermission, several audience members approached the stage to thank the musicians personally. An elderly woman named Mrs. Patterson told Hans, through Maria's translation, that his music reminded her of her late husband, who had played clarinet in their church band. A young mother explained that this was the first time her children had seen their father dance since he returned from the Pacific Theater. The most moving moment came when Sam Tucker requested a special song. "This was my boy Jimmy's favorite," he said, his voice barely steady. "He used to play it on the piano before he shipped out." The song was Moonlight Serenade, and as Hans played the flowing melody, the entire barn seemed to hold its breath. Couples swayed slowly in each other's arms, and more than a few eyes glistened with tears that spoke of absent loved ones and cherished memories. In that moment, Hans understood that he wasn't just playing music. He was helping people remember what they were fighting to preserve. As the evening drew to a close, the band played one final song, a simple, beautiful melody that Hans had learned from his grandmother years ago. He had taught it to his American partners during the week, and now they played it together as naturally as if they had been making music together for years. When the last note faded into the Texas night, the applause was thunderous and sustained. People stood on hay bales, whistled and called for more, but Hans knew that the evening had reached its perfect conclusion. As he packed his clarinet with hands that trembled slightly from emotion and exhaustion, he realized that something fundamental had changed within him. If this story has moved you, leave a like. It helps Hans's story reach more people, and remember what war tried to erase, our shared humanity. Sunday morning dawned quiet and peaceful over the prisoner camp, but Hans awoke to find that the world had shifted on its axis. The silence in his barracks was different now. Not the oppressive quiet of men who had given up hope, but the contented stillness of those who had remembered what it meant to be fully human. Word of the barn dance's success had spread throughout the camp and beyond. When Hans walked to breakfast, he noticed the guards looking at him differently, not with suspicion or mere tolerance, but with something approaching respect. Several nodded and smiled, and Sergeant Morrison actually tipped his hat in greeting. "Hell of a show last night, partner," Morrison said as Hans passed. "Haven't seen folks that happy in years. You done something special." But it was the reaction of his fellow prisoners that surprised Hans most. Men who had barely spoken to him before approached with quiet words of gratitude and amazement. They had heard about the dance, about how their fellow prisoner had been treated not as an enemy but as an honored guest, and it had given them something they had almost forgotten: dignity. Friedrich pulled Hans aside after breakfast, his baker's hands clasped tightly together as he struggled to find words. "You showed them who we really are," he said finally. "Not just enemies or prisoners, but people, musicians, craftsmen, fathers and sons. You reminded them that we're human." The impact extended far beyond the camp's boundaries. Over the following days, visitors began arriving, not military officials or inspectors, but local residents who had heard about the barn dance and wanted to meet the German musician who had brought such joy to their community. Colonel Hayes, recognizing the positive public relations opportunity, allowed supervised visits in the camp's recreation area. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman who had spoken to Hans the night of the dance, arrived on Tuesday with her granddaughter and a worn photograph. Through Maria's translation, she explained that the photograph showed her late husband's church band from 30 years earlier. "He would have loved playing with you," she told Hans, tears in her eyes. Music was his language too, and he always said that good musicians recognized each other regardless of where they came from. The visits continued throughout the week. Sam Tucker brought his foreman and a bottle of his late son's favorite soda, which he shared with Hans while they talked about music and loss and the strange ways that life brings people together. A group of local school children came with their teacher, eager to hear the clarinet up close and ask questions about Germany that had nothing to do with war. Perhaps most significantly, the pastor of the local Methodist church, Reverend William Clark, extended an invitation that stunned everyone at the camp. He asked if Hans would consider playing hymns during Sunday services, explaining that his congregation had been deeply moved by what they had heard about the barn dance. "Music is God's gift to all humanity," Reverend Clark told Colonel Hayes during their meeting. "It seems to me that sharing that gift is a form of worship, regardless of the musician's nationality or current circumstances." The request sparked considerable discussion among the camp's administrators and the military hierarchy. Allowing a German POW to participate in American church services was unprecedented, potentially controversial, and definitely outside normal protocols. But Colonel Hayes, perhaps influenced by the overwhelmingly positive response from the local community, decided to approve a trial arrangement. Hans's first church performance was scheduled for the third Sunday after the barn dance. As that morning approached, he found himself experiencing a different kind of nervousness than he had felt before the dance. This wasn't about entertainment or celebration. This was about something deeper, more sacred. The Methodist church was a simple white building with tall windows that let in streams of morning light. Hans sat with his clarinet in the front pew, wearing his best clothes and trying to calm his racing heart. When Reverend Clark introduced him to the congregation, explaining the unusual circumstances that had brought them together, the welcome was warm and genuine. The hymns Hans played that morning, "Amazing Grace," "How Great Thou Art," and "Blessed Assurance," seemed to take on new meaning in his hands. His clarinet voiced the familiar melodies with a poignancy that spoke of redemption. of finding grace in unexpected places, of the mysterious ways that music can heal wounds that words cannot touch. After the service, congregation members lingered to speak with Hans, sharing their own stories of music and faith, of family members serving overseas, of prayers for peace and understanding. An elderly man named Robert Hayes, no relation to the colonel, told Hans that his music had helped him feel closer to his son, who was serving somewhere in the Pacific. "Music is a prayer without words," Robert said, shaking Hans's hand firmly. "Thank you for reminding us that God hears all our prayers in every language." As autumn progressed into winter, Hans's role in the camp and community continued to evolve. He formed a permanent musical group with his American partners, and they began performing at various community events, church socials, school programs, and holiday celebrations. The Camp Liberty Orchestra became a beloved fixture in the area, a symbol of hope and reconciliation in a world still torn by conflict. And also began teaching music to interested prisoners and community members. The camp commandant approved the establishment of regular music lessons, and soon Hans found himself with a steady stream of students eager to learn clarinet, music theory, or simply how to read musical notation. One particularly memorable student was Bobby Tucker, Sam Tucker's nephew, a shy 12-year-old who had shown up one day with a battered trumpet and a burning desire to learn. Hans worked with the boy patiently, communicating through the universal language of music and Maria's translations, watching as Bobby's confidence grew along with his musical ability. "Uncle Sam says you're teaching me the same way Jimmy used to," Bobby told Hans one afternoon after a lesson. "He says Jimmy would have liked you a lot." The winter of 1944 brought news of the war's progression. Allied advances, German retreats, the gradual tightening of the noose around the Third Reich. For Hans, these developments were complicated. Part of him hoped for peace, for an end to the killing and destruction, but another part worried about what the war's end would mean for his newfound life in Texas. It was Colonel Hayes who finally addressed the elephant in the room during one of their regular meetings. The colonel had made a habit of checking in with Hans weekly, partly for administrative purposes, but mostly because he genuinely enjoyed their conversations about music and life. "Hans," the colonel said one cold December morning, "I know you must be thinking about what happens when this war ends. I want you to know that you've made a real difference here, not just in this camp, but in this entire community. Whatever the future holds, you should be proud of what you've accomplished." Hans nodded, though the uncertainty of his future remained a constant concern. Would he be repatriated to a devastated Germany? Would there be opportunities to continue making music? Would the friendships and connections he had formed in Texas survive the transition to peace? But on Christmas Eve 1944, as Hans stood before the congregation of the Methodist Church playing Silent Night, first in German, then in English, surrounded by people who had welcomed him as a friend rather than an enemy, he realized that some gifts transcend circumstances. The music would always be with him, as would the memory of discovering that humanity's capacity for compassion could survive even the worst conflicts. Years later, when Hans had returned to Germany and rebuilt his life as a music teacher in post-war Berlin, he would keep a worn photograph on his desk, a picture of the Camp Liberty Orchestra taken the night of that first barn dance. In the photo, 5 men stand together with their instruments, their faces bright with the joy of making music together. You cannot tell from the picture who is American and who is German, who is guard and who is prisoner. You can only see musicians, united in the universal language that makes all people neighbors. The photograph would serve as Hans's daily reminder of a simple truth he learned in the Texas desert, that even in the darkest times, music can build bridges where walls once stood, and that the human heart's capacity for connection is stronger than any force that seeks to divide us. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and tell us in the comments which part touched you most, because sometimes peace begins when we retell the past with empathy.